This is an interesting hand. It doesn't really look like it if you look at the action that takes place, but if you think about it, there's some interesting things to talk about here. So let's see what happens. Folds to Zizmo, who decides to call. And we've seen him do some weird things before, so I'm not really shocked at this. I don't really ever open limp, but this is something that usually worse players tend to do. I don't really think there's, it happens pretty often, but it's not really any benefit to it besides just making like a min raise instead, especially now that there are antes in the tournament. Blinds did just go up. So it folds to D-Fish, who decides to call as well, behind Bryn, and I call, and Sloppy Cloud calls. Flop comes 6 Jack Queen with 2 diamonds. I think there's some merit to leading here, which is something that I don't really do too often. But I don't really think it's the right play, only because if you lead here, you're going to get flat called a lot by somebody in this hand, and you're going to be in a very tough spot on the turn or river. So I check, Sloppy Cloud checks, Zizmo checks, and Bryn decides to bet 400 into about 600, and D-Fish calls. So now we look at this hand. And most people, when they see this, will be like, well, should we call or not call? And let's talk about that for a second. What is Bryn betting here with? Into 5 people, Bryn's probably not betting a hand like, let's say, ace-3 offsuit. Bryn's probably only betting hands for value or as a semi-bluff. Bryn's betting all of his diamonds, most of his queens, if not all of them, most of his good jacks, if not all of his jacks, King 10, Ace 10, maybe at worst, 10, 9, stuff like that. Sets, 2 pair, if he somehow has a set, which probably only means 6s, or if he has like Queen Jack. So that's Bryn's range. There's not too many bluffs in that range, and against that range of hands, especially being out of position, against Bryn alone, I have a pretty tough decision on a lot of turns and rivers. Now we see D-Fish call. What's D-Fish's range here? In a tournament, the person that bets, if let's say there's 2 people in a hand and somebody bets and the other person calls, the person that bets tends to have a weaker hand than the person that calls, strictly because the person that bets can be light, can be bluffing. Like look in this spot right here. Bryn probably doesn't have a hand like ace-3 offsuit, but D-Fish never has a hand like ace-3 offsuit. Bryn can decide to bluff in this spot, but D-Fish really probably isn't. To float in this spot in a 5-way pot is either very advanced or very bad. It's a very narrow line there. So I really don't think that D-Fish is calling here too light. D-Fish's range is very similar to Bryn's range in that D-Fish could have a lot of his queens, a lot of jacks, a lot of straight draws, flush draws, maybe like 2 6s, probably raises with a set or 2 pair, just like like you would expect him to. But none of that is very weak. And against both of their ranges, I do very poorly, especially being first to act. I think this is a pretty solid fold against 2 good players, and I do decide to fold. However, if we think about this in another light, looking at this hand, people usually will just think either about calling or folding. However, if there's one thing that you learn when playing poker for a long time, it's that you want to think even more out of the box. What else can I do in this spot besides calling and folding? I could decide to raise. What are the merits of that? Now, right or wrong, whether I end up deciding to actually raise or not, thinking about the merits of check raising is a good poker exercise to prepare yourself for spots in the future where it might be the right play. The very standard thing to do here is to just check fold. However, thinking about check raise in this spot is actually kind of interesting because we know that Bryn has a strong range, but doesn't usually ever include queens or jacks. Not like we do either if we check raise. But we know D-Fish probably doesn't have a hand like queen jack or 2 6s because that would probably raise. So the best hand D-Fish can have in this spot is probably a hand like king queen, maybe even king queen would re-raise preflop. Same with ace queen. And for Bryn, the same thing kind of holds true as well. Bryn probably re-raises preflop with a hand as good as ace queen or king queen versus a limper from a bad or potentially a bad player. So thinking about all of that, we can certainly have a hand like 2 6s or queen jack or a very strong draw such as king 10 of diamonds, ace 10 of diamonds, even just like king 10 period. We probably don't have that, but we can definitely represent hands like big diamonds, 2 pair, or a set of 6s. And neither one of those players can really have, well, D-Fish definitely can't have 2 pair, but like I said, Bryn doesn't have a set either, or a hand as good as like king queen or ace queen. So if we check raise here to, let's say, there's 1390 in the pot. If we check raised here to, let's say, 1600, we're getting a pretty good price on our bluff, and it's kind of hard for Bryn or D-Fish to continue, because on any brick turn card from, let's say, 2 to 7, we can bet, and they're going to have to fold if they have, like, they're going to have a tough decision, because we're going to bet every time for sure. And if a diamond hits, it could fill us as well, because we could definitely be check raising with big diamonds. It puts them in a very weird spot. And if they just have a single pair in this spot, or like a weaker draw, let's say just 10-9 or like ace-10 or king-10, they really can't call in this spot. But we could win the pot with a check raise. It's an interesting play, and not one that I really think is the correct play in this spot, but thinking about the potential of other moves and not just doing the standard ABC play is something that you should probably be doing more often, and I should be doing more often as well. It's definitely out of the box, and it's a complicated thing, and it's not really cut and dry, but that's to become a better poker player by thinking about spots that are deceptively simple. And in this spot, I do just decide to fold, as I had said. But I think a check raise would have been interesting and might have won me the pot.